Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here in lesson 3 of our church history classes entitled Christ's Church Through the Ages. And as you can see on the screen above, we are in what is entitled The World of the New Testament Part 2. For those who weren't here in the first week, we had a very brief and simple introductory lesson as to why the study of church history is important for Christians throughout the ages. Last week we began this particular subsection of the world of the New Testament, getting an idea of what the historical context and background was for the time period that the Gospel in the New Testament itself was then written, and of course the age in which the church began. We last week specifically examined the Jewish background primarily and overwhelmingly, and specifically the march of the various empires of the world and the context of world history in relation to the Israelites and to the Hebrews, covering the Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire and the Empire of Alexander the Great and so on and so forth, down to the specific kind of political and more broadly geopolitical circumstance of the decades leading into the very advent of Christ himself. This week we're covering in that of the Roman background, and it'll be done in 2 parts essentially, so this week and next week, where this week the Roman background will be from, again, that broader macroscopic perspective in regards to history, and it will then feed into the more specific details of the first century proper that we then cover next week. The reason why we're doing this in this particular fashion or order is by virtue of the necessity that exists for us to be able to understand what the first century was like and understand the context of the first few centuries of the church. We need to understand what actually went into building that. Just like we had last week, we covered the Jewish component or the Jewish background of that. This week we're now doing the Roman side of the proverbial equation. So this morning, or this afternoon rather I should say, we'll be focused on, just like last week, the history of the origins of Rome, okay? And particularly the way in which we arrive at what we call the Greco-Roman world. This is the world that came to be across the course of centuries, that was in full fruition by the time of the advent of Christ and of the arrival of the new covenant of Christ's kingdom. And so the Greco-Roman world is what we are building into, and we have to understand what went into that to then give us a really adequate understanding of what the socio-cultural perspective of the world was at that time. Various cultures and civilizations, especially complex ones that are worthy of the name civilization, do not just merely pop up in a vacuum with no backing, with no story, with no history, with nothing behind it. These things develop over time in very fascinating and complex ways, and there is arguably nothing more complex nor fascinating than the development of the Greco-Roman world as what is quite clearly the preeminent of the ancient civilizations. And so a lot of our focus this morning will be on what goes into the arrival and the creation of the Greco-Roman world as we know it. So by Greco-Roman world, what we specifically mean is the regions of the world that culturally and historically were directly influenced by the civilization of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. As we'll see today in part, particularly next week, there's a lot of overlap between those two, and it is called Greco-Roman for a very good reason, because of the shared common history and culture, but more on that, of course, as we progress. This world came about, in part from what we saw last week. It came about by the conquests of the Macedonian Empire, right, under Alexander the Great, of course, in the late 4th century BC, and then was followed on after the time of the height and the rise of the Greeks by the successive and expansive conquests of the then Roman Republic, which then grew and morphed into the Roman Empire as we know it. And this society, this civilization of the Greco-Roman world is what would come to dominate and predominate and to effectively rule the world as we know it. We had some graphs and figures last week that were along those lines of what on earth constituted the world as understood, particularly in reference to the Mediterranean. You'll see this in figure 1 in your study guides there. This particular graph, as you see before us, shows the progressive expansions and conquests of the Roman Republic. You'll see the areas in the Italian peninsula, which is the darker or deeper red as a time period from the 3rd century. By the time you move on to the 2nd century BC, so now about 100-ish years in advance, the lighter shade of red, almost pinkish kind of colour that dominates Greece, that dominates the western end of what we call Asia Minor, so western Turkey. You'll see also covers there the Iberian Peninsula, which was known to the Romans as Hispania, which is where today we call Spain and Portugal, as well as the 2 Sicilies in the west of the Mediterranean, as well as Carthage, which is the little light red or light pinkish colour there in North Africa, kind of towards the western side of it. This advancement, by the time we arrive at the mid to late 2nd century BC, is after, as I mentioned in passing last week, Rome has won back-to-back wars against the Carthaginian Empire, who was the other superpower that they competed with, leading to the utter annihilation of Carthage and essentially the wiping of that civilization off the face of the map by the Romans after the 3rd Punic War. It expands to the more orange sections on your map, areas of North Africa, particularly the areas up in Western Europe, which were called Gaul historically. Today we know it as France and Belgium. This is, as you'll see there in the legend up in the top right corner, from the year 44 BC, which is the date or the year in which Julius Caesar was assassinated. And that area, particularly up there in Gaul, in northwestern, or in Western Europe rather, was conquered by Caesar during what's known as Caesar's Gallic Wars. Nevertheless, you then expand to the areas that are yellow, which obviously covers a lot of that map that you see there. The yellow sections are dated to the death of the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, who we'll talk about quite a bit today towards the end. His reign ended in 14, officially at least, ended with his death in AD 14, and that's the areas by which to which the empire had expanded. And you'll notice there that Judea is covered under that yellow bit down in the bottom right corner, so to speak. If you look down there into the land of Judea, now Rome had officially absorbed with the kingdoms that we looked at last week, and particularly the tetrarchy, the Herodian tetrarchy that we looked at last week, into their empire. And then the green is the further expansion to the maximum of Rome's heightened power and territorial gain under Trajan in 117 AD. And so it's at that point that we actually then see the empire at its greatest extent. We had that referenced last week. That's now in figure 2 in your guides there. This is the Roman Empire. Obviously, it's after the time of the apostles, but it's still now in the early decades of the church, where the church is 80-ish years into its existence, roughly speaking, and under its greatest height there. This is Rome that had conquered the world. They conquered every single square mile of the Mediterranean coastline. And so this is the Greco-Roman world as we know it. But in order to understand what on earth that world looked like, we need to understand how it came to be. We need to understand how we got there, so to speak. And the rise of the Greco-Roman world and the establishment of that civilization as the preeminent civilization, not just in the world at its time, but quite clearly that the world had ever seen, to that point at least, comes with a most fascinating backdrop and explains very thoroughly to us not just the historical minutiae for the sake of intellectual or academic rigour, but rather it will allow us, hopefully, by the time we've then explored the origins of Rome, to actually see the context of what that civilization was, how people in that civilization thought, how they behaved, how they acted, so on and so forth, and then have that as the backdrop within which we see the New Testament come to fruition and the church born and rising, and seeing, and hopefully it will illuminate, even in a kind of rudimentary or elementary sense, some of the ways or the reasons why the Apostle Paul, for example, writes the way he does to the church at Corinth, for example, most notably. This church which was ingratiated in one of the most pagan cities in the entire world, that of Corinth. This will hopefully illumine our minds even just to that level, and you'll see by the end the reasons and the basis why the Roman Empire was, in fact, what it was. And so, over time, to give you the very simplified version, Rome had a number of founding myths, a number of founding legends. These accounts, historical and otherwise, that went into their identity or the foundation of the identity of what it meant to even be a Roman. Some of these were of native origin, that is to say native to Italia or to the Italian peninsula. Some of them were attributed by the Greeks. For centuries and centuries on end before the rise of the empire, there had been a lot of proverbial cross-pollination between the Romans and the Greeks. The Greeks had established colonies all over the world, all the way back to their golden age, which was the 5th century BC, so the 400s, which is held as the height of classical civilization in Greece. It's the proverbial Greek golden age. They had, and as I referenced in passing last week, they had colonies all the way up in what they called the Pontic, or what we today call the Black Sea. They had it all around the Mediterranean basin, even all the way as far west as Spain and particularly southern France. Right? The city of Marseille is indeed originally a Greek colony there in the south of France. And so they had colonies all over the world. They had particularly, and this was certainly one of the most, if not the most important section of foreign Greek colonies, was what we call historically Magna Graeca, which just simply means in Latin, Greater Greece. These were the colonies, the Greek colonies, in the south of Italy, particularly in Sicily. Okay, a number of famous historical cities like Syracuse, like Croton, etc. These were all Greek colonies, and Greece controlled and had Greek people, what I suppose we today in the West would call expats, living in southern Italy. And so there's a lot of cross-pollination going on for 500 plus years between Greek and Roman cultural identities. This allowed, or brought about indeed, the rise of founding legends and other such cultural identifications from the Greeks, applying it onto the Latins as they were known historically, as they would then come to be known more specifically the Romans as a constituent element thereof. And so by the time we get to the 1st century AD itself, with the advent of Christ, with the age of the apostles, with the creation of the New Testament canon, we arrive at a time in which the founding legend of Rome had very much been settled by that point. And that was not solely, obviously, but largely because of the widespread success of a very famous historical work known as the Aeneid, okay, which was written by the ancient Roman poet Virgil, one of the most famous of the classical poets, who was of Roman origin, late 1st century BC, right during the time of the rise of Augustus and the Caesars and the founding of the empire itself. And he published that. He wrote that between 29 and 19 BC and then published it in the year of his death, 19 BC. And the Aeneid was the kind of categorization of the founding legend of Rome. It was one of the most powerful propagandistic or didactic pieces in all of ancient history that came about in no coincidence during the reign of the first Roman imperator, that is to say Emperor Caesar Augustus. And so it's in that we find the first kind of component of this morning's focus regarding the origins of Rome is that of a man or a figure by the name of Aeneas. Now, a number of these figures, because there is cross-pollination between the Greek and the Romans, I'm going to favour the Roman/English pronunciation, just for simplicity's sake, especially because I've written them down in English. So I'll favour their pronunciations. But Aeneas is one of the single most important figures in all of Roman legend and Roman history. His story is recorded for us in another of the famous classical and ancient works known as the Iliad. The Iliad was written by the famous Greek poet Homer, roughly speaking around the year 800 BC. Okay? And it served as a major component of Greek legend, history and mythology. The Iliad, in simplified terms, is a poetic epic, what we call an epic as a genre, that detailed for the Greeks the 10th and final year of the Trojan War, which based on historical dating is usually dated to between 1194 to 1184 BC, and it accounts the 10th and final year of that siege. During that war, an alliance of the Mycenaean Greek city-states, purportedly to the tune of a navy of 1,000 warships, crossed the Aegean Sea to invade Troy at the behest of King Menelaus of Sparta, by virtue of the fact that his wife, Helen of Sparta, had been absconded away by Paris, the Prince of Troy. His brother, King Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, hence the name Mycenaean Greeks, was the most powerful man in Greece at that time, and he used it as a very convenient crisis or opportunity in which to launch the invasion of the famous ancient city of Troy, which was one of the most luxurious and the most powerful ancient Greek cities in the world. The Iliad, a fascinating account, but what it does for us is it's in and amongst that accounting of the Trojan War, mixed in, of course, with legend and mythology. But the accounting of that war, we find the figure of Aeneas, who is the primary focus in regards to at least this Roman perspective. Aeneas was a member of the Trojan royal family. He was a cousin, or really technically a second or third cousin, I think, actually, of some of the main figures of the Iliad, like Hector, the Prince of Troy, the great warrior who fought and died at the hands of the Greek warrior Achilles. At the fall and the destruction subsequently of Troy by the Greeks as they came through the city by the trick of their famous Trojan horse, which is where we get that story from. Right? The Greeks feigning as if they had fled and had left, and they left this gift of victory to the Trojans, which was this big giant wooden horse, within which were a whole host of Greek soldiers. And of course the Trojans, as the story goes, let the horse into the city. They parade this giant wooden statue that they would then sacrifice to the gods in honour, and so on and so forth. And then during the middle of the night, as all the guards are asleep, thinking they've won the great victory and there's nothing more to worry about now, the Greek warriors hop out, open the gates, and the Greek armies storm the city. During that destruction and fall, among others, Aeneas and his family and his army are some of the few people that escape Troy successfully. And they flee Troy, and they then begin to wander and journey around the world. Now, in regards to Aeneas specifically, and this is important because it comes up later on as one of the most important points. In Greek legend and mythology specifically, Aeneas, was what we call a demigod. A demigod means someone in Greco-Roman mythology, or in ancient mythology generally, who has one mortal parent and one divine parent. In this case of Aeneas, he had a mortal father who was also part of the Trojan royal family. He then had a divine mother, namely Aphrodite, who was known to the Romans as Venus. That's the Roman equivalent. And so he has a mortal father, divine mother, and is therefore a demigod. And this is obviously a place of esteem to the Greco-Roman kind of cultural context. He being a demigod, and that'll come up certainly later. And so it's then at that point that we find Aeneas travelling around the world, and his accounting, the account that Virgil gives, 1,200 years later practically, in the late 1st century BC, in the Aeneid, which is named after Aeneas, right, is that he then journeys and travels around the Mediterranean world, or what was just simply the world as they knew it, right? Not too dissimilar to Odysseus and the Odyssey, which was almost like the sequel to the Iliad written by Homer, of Odysseus, one of the great kings, the king of Ithaca, who then spent 20 years travelling home and all this incredible, legendary, mythical encounters with cyclopses and giants and so on and so forth. Aeneas undergoes a similar journey, and to keep a long story short, he eventually ends up landing in Latium. Latium, the region of what is geographically western central Italy. This was at the time ruled by the king Latinus, and they land on the banks or the shore of the river Tiber. The Tiber River is the river that runs from the coast all the way through Rome itself, obviously including to this day, of course. And so they land there after having gone to a number of other places. Upon landing there, and this is just a short part, because there's a huge amount of the Aeneid dedicated to this portion at least, but for our sake and for the point that we're trying to focus on, it becomes relevant later on. Aeneas takes a journey to the underworld, and amongst a whole host of other things that go on there in that journey, he encounters his father, He encounters his father, who he had originally escaped with, but who had died on the journey. And he encounters him, and he's given he's given a vision of his descendants and of a great future city that his descendants would build. This is what the Aeneid is describing for people. This essentially this future of what, not that it was called that at the time, but what we retroactively look at as this vision of Rome. Upon having met his father, Anchises, and having been given that vision, we then start to see his interactions with the native king, the indigenous king, Latinus. And the indigenous king Latinus of Latium, is actually rather welcoming. The reason being is he's been given a prophecy or an oracle that a foreigner, right, a stranger, would marry his daughter, the princess Lavinia. Now, the problem with this is the fact that Lavinia had already been promised to someone else. Namely, she'd been promised to Turnus, who was a native king as well, the king of the Rutuli, which is one of the native Latin tribes. Okay. As you can probably well imagine, this causes a little bit of a furor. And by furor, what I mean is it leads to, naturally, Turnus declaring war on Aeneas. Okay? They go to war, and the Aeneid essentially rounds up and finishes in its great climax with the triumph of Aeneas over Turnus. And so you'll actually find there, I think it's in figure 3, I believe, the famous painting by Luca Giordano from the 17th century that is encapsulating this very much in the Renaissance style. You've got Aeneas there, triumphant, shield in hand, sword ready to pierce his enemy. You have Turnus there on the ground, terrified, accepting defeat that is coming right upon him in this great scene of triumph. You have what are called their geniuses. In simple terms, not that's the focus this morning, but a genius, and the concept of where we get the word genius from comes from Roman mythology. Your genius was basically almost what you'd equate to the kind of idea of a guardian angel. Right? Your genius was present with you from the moment you were born to the moment you died, and it followed you around, and it had this kind of providential effect on your life. So there's other feminine figures up there, one in the top left and one in the top right corner, are the respective geniuses of the victorious and conquering Aeneas and the defeated and slain Turnus. Obviously the one in the top left being Aeneas's, who is triumphant and advancing, and then Turnus's is hidden away and is fleeing the scene. You'll notice probably there, one of the most fascinating parts of this particular painting, how the left side, Aeneas' side essentially is illuminated and brightened, whereas the right side of the painting, that of Turnus's, is darkened. It has this progressive shadow that goes across to the edge. It's an incredible painting, and one of the most famous paintings of this part of the Aeneid. What you'll also notice, just very briefly, because it has some relevance tangentially to sermons, you may have heard me explain in times past, particularly when talking about the kingship of God and of Christ, that a common practice, almost to the point of being ubiquitous and universal throughout the ancient world and the medieval world, but particularly the ancient world, was that in order to demonstrate submission of either a defeated enemy or a defeated king, whatever the context, he would have to bow down or lie prostrate or anything else, and the victorious king, the triumphant king, that commander, that ruler, whatever, would place his foot on the back or the chest or the head of the conquered or vanquished enemy. And you'll see there that Aeneas is triumphant in stride, and his foot is on the breastplate of Turnus. That's exactly what I've been referencing in sermons past. I just thought that would be worth pointing out. And so that describes for us this story of Aeneas, this Trojan royal who is one of the few people to survive the fall and the destruction of Troy, who then has this incredible journey for years on end around the world and eventually lands in Latium, is welcomed by the king Latinus, is fulfilling this prophecy or this oracle given to the king about his daughter marrying a foreigner or a stranger. He then goes to war over this very prophecy and destiny, so to speak, and he then comes out triumphant. This is the story of Aeneas, this triumphant Trojan wanderer, journeyman, who then settles in the land of Latium, which is the very region of Italy where today Rome lies. That is largely, as I mentioned earlier, there were founding legends that were both of native or indigenous Latin origin, as well as those that had been influenced by the Greeks. Obviously, this is coming from the great epic, the Aeneid, by Virgil in 19 BC, which is of Roman origin, obviously. But it is very much, nevertheless, heavily influenced, of course, by the Greek influence, particularly by virtue of the fact that the Trojans were ethnically Greek. They weren't viewed the same way as Greeks in what we call the Mycenaean civilization, but they were ethnically of that same heritage and origin. All the people of what today is Western Turkey, so the Aegean coast of Turkey, were of Greek origin, and these cities like Troy, like Ephesus, these are other coastal cities that lie in that same coast of Turkey. These are Greek in origin, and they were Greek colonies and had been going back 3,000 plus years now. It's important to note that, because we then come to another very important aspect of this, which is in regards specifically to the story of the twins, Romulus and Remus. This is one of the founding legends that, again, originally, as far as we can tell, was of native Latin origin, so Italian origin, that was then worked into and incorporated into the settled founding legend or myth, which incorporates all of what we've talked about thus far. So when we get through this, we'll then see how these legends converge upon each other, especially by the time of the Aeneid and the rise of the empire itself. So, as I mentioned, the Greeks had recorded, so had to reconcile, the Greek legend had to be reconciled with the native Italian legend, and particularly that of Romulus and Remus. Now, these two were twins in the city of Alba Longa, right? Otherwise just simply known as Alba, but more broadly known as Alba Longa. Alba Longa as a city is basically the predecessor city of Rome itself, at least ancestrally or in regards to legacy or heritage. Okay, by legend and by historical account, Alba Longa was founded by Ascanius, who was the son of Aeneas. Okay, so you can already perhaps start to see where the connections are starting to kind of piece together. Right? Alba Longa is a city which is, and was rather, right near where today Rome lies and has been now for nearly 4,000 years, was founded by the son of Aeneas named Ascanius. And so it's in that particular context that we find the rise of this story of these two great twins, Romulus and Remus. Their mother, known as Rhea Silvia, she was what's called a Vestal Virgin, or in other words, a virgin priestess of the Roman goddess Vesta. Okay, so she was a virgin priestess in the cult of Vesta. And she was the daughter of King Numitor, who, as I have written there for you, was the former king, the reason being that he had been deposed or overthrown by his usurper, who was indeed his brother, Amulius. This plays an influence into the rise of Romulus and Remus, and we'll see that kind of as we go through. Again, like Aeneas, Romulus and Remus were both demigods. In this case, it was the opposite. They had a mortal mother, Rhea Silvia, and a divine father, namely Mars, the god of war. And that will become a fascinating point by the time we then scale this down to this nexus of the first century. And so keep the pins in the proverbial story here as we work our way through. The twins Romulus and Remus are both demigods like Aeneas. In this case, mortal mother, a Vestal Virgin, so a priestess virgin, and a divine father, no less Mars, the god of war. What we find then is that following this, most likely due to the fact that he saw them as a threat, naturally they were the grandchildren, the grandsons particularly, of the king who he had just overthrown. King Amulius indeed orders that the twins be put to death. And he does so by exposing them, leaving them, what's called exposure as an actual form of death, leaving them to the elements to die by leaving them on the banks of the river Tiber. This story, as you'll see, has some interesting commonalities with the story of Moses. And there usually is good reason for that. But he leaves them on the banks of the river Tiber, which ran through from the coast through to what is today, what was then Alba Longa, and as well as today the city of Rome itself. They were saved by the native god of that river, Tiberinus, but then they were, after being saved by him, they were then raised, at least in their early infancy, by a she-wolf named Lupa. This is where the story gets interesting and weird to us at the same time. They're raised by a wolf. Eventually they're then found and rescued by a shepherd, right, named Faustius. But nevertheless, they're raised, and one of the important components of that is they're actually raised by a wolf in a wolf pack-like circumstantial setting during the early years of their life in their infancy. And this again plays into heavily the legendary or mythological backdrop of the Roman kind of cultural context. And so it's in this next particular figure you'll see there, it'll be figure number 4. This is what we know as the Capitoline wolf. one of the most famous bronze statues from the ancient Roman era. There's debate as to when it's from, but it's most likely of Etruscan origin from about the 5th century BC. Okay, so 500 years before the time of the 1st century. Whether or not the 2 infants were present in the original is unknown, but nevertheless, this symbol and this statue would become a vital component of Roman cultural identity. You would find it in artwork, you would find it in Roman coins of the Capitoline wolf, this she-wolf Lupa, who then nursed the 2 infants Romulus and Remus. And this would become a staple in Roman culture, as I mentioned, in artwork, in coinage, so on and so forth. Right? A fundamental component of the Roman culture was the story of Romulus and Remus, who were nursed in their infancy by a wolf. And so, having then grown up, now to adulthood, the twins naturally enact their vengeance upon their usurper uncle, who overthrew what would be, or in the aspect of a great uncle, so what would be their grandfather that he overthrew. So they then in turn seek vengeance upon their great uncle. And the reinstating of Numius, their grandfather, then occurs, who now comes back to reign as king of Alba Longa. And indeed, they then go on kind of victorious and triumphant as the story goes, and they set off on a journey to found and create their own new city, essentially. And so this is where we're starting to see this idea of not just the story, but then indeed the actual pragmatics of Rome itself being founded. And we're starting to see this kind of converge at a particular head in Romulus and Remus. Naturally, however, as some brothers want to do, quarrelling and infighting breaks out among the 2 brothers. Pride, hubris, arrogance, the great, as the Romans would call it, virtus, the masculine honour, is something that was clearly present in the 2 of these twins. And so arguments and quarrelling break out regarding which actual hill to build the city upon, which one to found it as the centre. Okay? Rome is known, and has been known since ancient times, as the city built upon 7 hills. Okay? The famous 7 hills of Rome, these come up explicitly in the book of Revelation, to this reference of a city of 7 hills, in reference to Rome itself. And their argument and dispute about which actual hill to begin the city upon, to found it upon, became a point of contention. Romulus favoured a hill known as the Palatine Hill, very important, and then his brother Remus favoured a different type of hill, the Aventine Hill. And so it's then a matter of dispute and contention between the 2 of them. This, of course, does not tend to play out well as these things generally go. And so what they do, as most ancient pagans did, is they then decided to consult the gods. And they did so in a contest very familiar to Roman civilization known as augury. What on earth is augury? Augury, in very, very simple terms, is using oracular or divination powers to essentially look at the movements of birds in a given or particular sacred area that would be defined by the augur, who was almost basically like a priest. And then they would note down all the movements of particular birds. If there was the movements of, let's just say, a raven landed there, that would be one particular omen, versus if an eagle flew by soaring at great heights, that would be a different omen. Augury is where we get the word auspicious. So if something is of auspicious results, that's where we get that word from. Auspicious was used in a positive context in that case, but the word auspicious comes from this ancient Roman practice of augury. It's similar to the Semitic practice of casting lots, which you may be familiar with from the Old Testament particularly. Similar kind of idea. Long story short, using a particular mortal means to be able to determine the will or the vision of God / in this case the gods. Okay. Long story short, what ends up happening is Remus sees 6 auspicious birds, but Romulus, his brother, sees 12 auspicious birds. And without complicating what exactly those meant, it, long story short, meant that, at least according to the proverbial unwritten rules, Romulus would have the favour of the gods. That's essentially the conclusion. Naturally, this didn't go well for Remus. They disputed the results between them, and it ended up with resulting in Romulus killing his brother, Remus, when Remus insulted him over this matter. The brother dies. Romulus is shown to be triumphant not just by the assent or the favour of the gods, but indeed also by now the death of his own brother. And so Romulus goes on to found the city, which would be called Rome, named in his honour. Rome, Romulus. You can see the etymological connection there, hopefully. And he reigned for many years as its founding king. And so this is the foundation of the Roman kingdom, or the kingdom of Rome, which is dated to 753 BC. He is then credited throughout Roman history with the creation of its institutions, with its military, its government, as well as its long-standing and complex religious traditions. He is then seen and held as the founder of Rome itself and of the Roman kingdom, which would then, later on in 510 and 509, be overthrown into a republic, which would then stand for 500 years, not monolithically, but ultimately on paper for 500 years, before we then get to what then eventually is the rise of the Roman Empire itself. And so, in order to try and create, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of consistency that was necessary between what most likely is the native legend of Romulus and Remus with the most likely Greek originating legend of Aeneas, that had to all be brought in together and to be syncretized to make an actual cohesive legend that actually made sense to someone even remotely rational or who is intending to ask questions about what went on. Okay, this is what we then find developing. And so what ends up happening is two major components. One, Romulus and his founding of Rome is seen, at least broadly, it's more complex than this, but at least at a fundamental level, is seen as the fulfillment of the vision or the scene that Aeneas was shown by his father in the underworld. You may recall me saying to put a pin in that, right, earlier on. This vision that Aeneas, this great oracle that was given by his father in his journey to the underworld of his descendants and of a great future city that his descendants would build, this was then held to be Romulus having fulfilled that. This then presented another issue, one could suppose, and again, we're looking back on this anachronistically or with retrospect and trying to piece together how they pieced it together. But what it ended up needing was, how did you get from Aeneas and his son Ascanius down to Romulus? And so what was then introduced into the story, most likely, or what certainly then becomes commonplace, is that there was a lineage or a heritage going back 15 generations between Romulus back to Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. And so he was actually then held, and had been held, by the time we get to the Aeneid in the 1st century AD and BC, for centuries Romulus had now been held as the descendant of Ascanius and ultimately of Aeneas himself. Okay, and so there was this connection and this line of ancestry that was then commonly held and taught as obvious universal fact between Romulus and his ancestors, Ascanius, and his father, Aeneas in particular. And so what this eventually ends up doing for us is it creates this convergence, this line of descent from the Trojans to the Albans, right, to the Alba Longa, and to the Romans. The Trojans, the Albans, and the Romans share this common history, this common ancestry, literally and figuratively. So there's a cultural and historical legacy that joins those various places / cultures, going all the way back to the ancient Trojans, which is 3,000 plus years ago. And even by the time we get to the 1st century, okay, the Trojan War is nearly 1,200 years prior. Right? It would be like us sitting here today looking at the origins of the English monarchy, and by extension the British monarchy, with the founding of it under King Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, okay, as the first king of the Anglo-Saxons, or the king of England. Almost exactly the same time period. Okay, so we look back as the early medieval period, they were looking back on as the ancient Greeks and the Trojans. Okay, and so this was to them historic in its nature. And this convergence of culture and ancestry and everything else in between reaches a nexus point in the persons particularly of Gaius Julius Caesar and of his adopted son, Caesar Augustus, who would be, at least on paper, the first Roman emperor. And so it's at this point that we reach the particular convergence of everything we've heard thus far. The story of Aeneas, particularly outlined, not exclusively, but most popularly in the Aeneid by Virgil in the 1st century BC, as well as the famous story of Romulus and Remus, the twins raised by wolves as demigods, who would then go on to bring vengeance for their grandfather, for their family, and then found the city of Rome itself in the person of Romulus. What we have, by the time we get to the 1st century and the foundation of the empire, is the first dynasty of the emperors was known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty, for the simple reason that it was founded by two constituent families that were both related, namely what we call in Latin the Iuli Caesare, from the gens Julia, and I'll explain all that in a minute, as well as the Claudi Nerones from the gens Claudia. Okay, this reaches a convergence in Augustus. Okay, so originally known as Gaius Octavius, or just simply Octavius or Octavianus, he is adopted by Julius Caesar. He was, in terms of blood relation, his grandnephew. He's then adopted as his son, which in Roman law and custom made him as equal of a son as anyone else. Okay, there wasn't the kind of cultural distinction between an actual blood son and an adopted son. When you adopted a son, they were held in full regard. Okay, and an adopted son could be made your full, rightful, legal heir as well. And that's certainly the case in Augustus, in the example of Augustus. He then goes on to be known by his imperial name, which is Caesar Augustus, or more fully Imperator Caesar Augustus, and we'll explain what those terms mean mainly next week. But nevertheless, he founds this dynasty which considers and is constituted of the first 6 Roman emperors. Okay, from Augustus, who begins his reign in 27 BC, through to the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which is the famous emperor Nero, who dies in 68 AD. Okay, so for that roughly 80 to 90-ish year period, we have the reign of the first imperial dynasty of Rome, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We're not going to be talking about the Claudians, although they were a powerful and very famous Roman family, but particularly that of the family of what we know as the Iuli Caesare, right, which is where the name Julius Caesar comes from. Okay, so the famous figure of Julius Caesar is, we're actually using his family name there, right? His full name is Gaius Julius Caesar, or Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius is his first name, it's like Daniel. Julius is the actual name of the clan, right? So it would almost be like, with me, Thomas, and then it would be having what's called a cognomen, in this case, Caesar, which is the particular family within the clan of the Julians. Does that make sense? So the Caesars were the specific family within the broader clan of the Julians, who claimed descent from a figure called Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. Why? Because Ascanius, as we're told by Virgil, was also known as Iulus, from which the name Julius comes from. So in case anyone's missed what's going on there, the gens Iulia, or the Julian clan of Rome, were one of what we call the Trojan families. They claimed descent from Iulus, known from the Greek as Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. So in other words, what they were doing is they claimed to have direct descent from Aeneas himself. This is the family which has one of its most famous members, and by famous I mean the most famous, Julius Caesar, become the dictator of Rome, become, certainly in the popular convention, the first emperor. He wasn't literally the first emperor, certainly not on paper, Augustus was, but in terms of the popular common perception, Julius Caesar was pretty much the first. Okay, and that's not just speculative, that comes from what we actually see as the grounding in terms of propaganda and cultural narrative on the part of Augustus and the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They claimed descent ultimately from Aeneas, which means, if you recall from the very beginning, Aeneas's mother was Venus. So what they're doing is it's not just a matter of, this famous historical figure Aeneas. What they're also doing is they're actually claiming a divine origin. They're claiming we're ultimately descended from the goddess Venus, who is known to the Greeks as Aphrodite. But nevertheless, we're claiming divine descent. This is vital, absolutely central, fundamental and vital to the very rise and the existence of the Roman imperial house. It is literally and figuratively fundamental and foundational. The divine ancestry, okay? What we have is, as I mentioned earlier, Augustus was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, okay? Grand nephew in terms of relation, so he wasn't just some random, but he was adopted as his son. Full, rightful, legal heir. And so what Julius Caesar had done in his life and the many great conquests, his victory in the civil war that he waged against, technically on paper, the Senate of Rome, when he crossed the Rubicon. This is where this phrase crossing the Rubicon comes from, right? He had just successfully conquered all of Gaul, killed probably about 1 million people in the process. He'd failed in his invasion of Britain, which was repelled by the native Britons, and then returns to Rome. And without boring you with all the auxiliary details, he eventually crosses the Rubicon in northern Italia, which would then mean that his army would be present on Roman land. That was illegal. Okay, it's like what the Americans have. It's illegal for the United States military to operate on American soil. He didn't exactly heed that law, and so he crossed the Rubicon River, which was the barrier, and that automatically meant it was a declaration of civil war against the Senate. He becomes dictator for life, very popular because of the fact that he was a strong man, and he actually brought order to the chaos of the 1st century BC Roman Republic. He was then eventually assassinated, most famously in 44 BC, but his son, adopted obviously, Augustus, takes up the proverbial mantle that his father, adopted, Julius Caesar, had left for him. He goes on to consolidate the empire. He has the help of Pompey the Great, one of the great Roman generals and one of the great ancient generals in history. He then defeats, famously, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and he conquers the Ptolemaic kingdom, which ruled Egypt. You may recall from last week, we had the Ptolemaic kingdom come up, right? That was one of the successor states to Alexander the Great, which had lasted all the way down to Cleopatra herself. Okay? He consolidates the empire, having been descended, now on paper, legally, from Julius Caesar. Why is this important? Julius Caesar, not long after his death in 44 BC, was deified. Okay, and that occurred specifically in 42 BC. What do we mean by deified? What we mean is Julius Caesar was elevated to the status of a god, right? Deified coming from the word deity, which some of you are familiar with, right? He was made a god. He ascended into the pantheon of the gods. Okay, very rare, right? And famous figures which had undergone that kind of what we call in technical terms an apotheosis, which is the technical name for being deified. These are historical figures like Achilles. These are figures like Hercules, although Hercules was a demigod anyway. These are famous figures from Greco-Roman mythology and legend. Okay, Caesar had now undergone this after his death, so it was posthumously, but this had a humongous impact upon the foundation of the empire. Because as you can see before you, what does it now logically mean? Piecing together the pieces, Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar, of the gens Julia, of the Julian clan, is already, as far as their claim, descended from Venus. Okay, they already have a divine origin. He now has been deified himself, so now he has been made a god, like his ancestor Venus. And so now Augustus, in more than one way, not just in like an ethereal historic sense, but is now literally what the Romans would then call divi filius, son of a god. Okay? Son of a god. Otherwise known as well, specifically related to Julius Caesar, as divi Iuli filius, right? Son of the divine Julius. Okay? Common, well, it wasn't used super heavily during Augustus's reign, right? It was there. It became really prominent after Augustus's death and after the successive emperors after him, like Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, Nero especially, so on. Right? This became one of the foundational doctrinal points of the imperial cult and of the worship of the Roman emperors, because they were sons of a god. There was a distinctly, resolutely, overtly divine aspect to the Roman imperial system. Does that make sense? Yep. Explicitly divine. And it served as the fundamental and foundational propagandistic basis of the very imperial house or system as a concept in Roman society. This is fascinating, by the way, just a very brief side point, which I suppose we'll touch on next week. The Romans, even at this point, still have a lingering cultural aversion to monarchy. Okay? Neither Julius Caesar nor Augustus ever adopted the Latin title of Rex, R-E-X, which is the Latin word for king. Okay? So countries that still use it in formal settings, like Britain does, right? Charles III is known in Latin as Carolus Rex. Okay, Rex meaning king, so Carolus meaning Charles the king. They never adopted that title. Julius Caesar never adopted it. There's a famous story. How true it is in reality, we don't know. It could be propagandistic, but anyway, there is an account or a story at least associated with Julius Caesar that at a great festival and party to his triumph and his many victories and so on and so forth, someone brings up a wreath, a famous Roman wreath which was formed in the shape of a crown, and tried to honour Julius Caesar as King of Rome. He explicitly and overtly rejected it in a way that everyone at that gathering would see. Even though he's the dictator perpetuo, the dictator for life, okay? Which is a position that had been held before. Dictator we think of in negative terms now for very obvious reasons. Historically, the term dictator, which comes from Rome, was just simply an authoritarian figure who would be installed temporarily in the time of crisis, right? If Rome was invaded, for example, when the Gothic tribes invaded Rome in 390 BC, a dictator was installed, right, to command that issue, okay? Nevertheless, by the time we get to Augustus, who's now claiming the title of imperator, which is actually not a royal title, we think of emperor, which is where we get the English word emperor. We think of that as, well, this is the greatest monarchical title, an emperor, right, a king over other kings, right? The British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, right? Ironically, the word imperator was not a royal title. It was a military title. Okay, it literally means the one in authority or the one in command. So what's fascinating here, and please you have to understand this because this informs a lot of what we see in the New Testament. At the exact same time that the Romans are explicitly avoiding the title of king because of their republican history for the last 500 years, their imperators, which are installed for life, are literally held as divine. This is, and we have a prime example of this, this is the direct equivalent, literally, not figuratively, literally, if the American presidents were then held as divine, as gods, but maintained the title of president. Okay, so not a royal title, not on paper at least, even though the American president is the most powerful man in the history of the world, and that the emperors and kings of old could only dream of the power the American president has, but that part aside. This is as if the American president was then held as being divine, was given a statue like Abraham Lincoln has, where he's enthroned like Zeus, in Washington, D.C., or like you have with Washington himself, the first American president and the great general of the American Revolutionary War, who in the dome of the Capitol building has a Renaissance-style painting called the Apotheosis of Washington, where he's literally up among the Roman pantheon of gods. That part aside, for the capital of a Christian nation. But anyway, this is as wild as that would be. The American president's still being called president in a republican system with a Congress or a Senate, yet also being held widely and universally to be actual sons of a god and to be divine, at least in partful nature. This is the reality of the Roman emperors. Not kings, only demigods, right? It's crazy. And so this is what we have. Couple this with the fact, by the way, as well as to round this point off, right, as we round up this morning, the city itself, keeping in mind the story of Romulus and Remus, they were also demigods whose father was Mars, the Roman god of war. Mars, the Roman god of war, the equivalent of Ares. They're descended from Venus, the Roman equivalent of Aphrodite. In Greco-Roman mythology, Mars and Venus are husband and wife. Okay? Just as in the Greek side of the equation, you have a scenario where Ares, the Greek god of war, and Aphrodite, the Greek god of love and beauty, are husband and wife. So now you have converged in one place, and follow this, the Roman emperors literally descended from Venus, symbolically, by virtue of the fact that they rule Rome, descended, not ancestrally but culturally, from Mars, who themselves, Mars, Venus, are couple, are husband and wife. It's the complete package. And all of this influences the complete cultural conscience and consciousness of the Roman society. This influences how they view themselves as Romans. This influences how they view their place in the world itself. Okay, and I'll leave you with this last image we have here. This is one of the most famous Roman statues in existence, okay? You'll have it there, I believe, in figure number 5, it should be, if I can find it. Yep, figure number 5, right? The statue itself is known as Augustus of Prima Porta, simply because it was found in the zona, or the suburb in Rome called Prima Porta. This was discovered back in 1863, I believe, AD, 1863, by a team of archaeologists who were excavating the site of the house of Augustus's third and final wife. Okay. Upon excavating it, they found this perfectly well-preserved statue of Augustus himself, and this really hammers home the perfect image and encapsulation of everything we've seen this morning. Okay, I've blown it up there for you on figure number 5 in your study guides there. Probably easier if you follow along on your page. You might be able to see in a bit more specific detail than the screen, but have a look at this, okay? There's a clear, at least on the surface level, a clear militaristic tone to this statue, all right? By virtue of the fact that he's dressed in an armoured breastplate, okay? He's got the garb hemmed up to the side, right? He's clearly in a strong imperial, and indeed imperious in the positive sense or negative, I don't even want to take it, presence, okay? He is putting out what has been kind of colloquially called what we think might have been the Roman salute, right, which may or may not have been the origin of this, if I then extend my arm a bit further up in the sky. This front out motion we see in certain pieces of artwork, which may have been the Roman salute, maybe. Nevertheless, it's a strong position with a breastplate on, right? Clear militaristic overt tones there, right? You may not be able to make out as easily because it requires like kind of zooming in on it, but there's a very divine scene going on here, but also has militaristic tones. On the clasps of the breastplate up on his shoulders, these two kind of straps that come over that are then pinned on, you'll see. What's on there on each side is a sphinx. Okay, as in the Sphinx from Egypt. This was clearly put there to signify his victory over Cleopatra and Mark Antony and the final ultimate Roman conquest of the Ptolemaic kingdom, i.e. Egypt. Okay, so that's a military, that's a clear nod to his military conquests, right? Taking a symbol of the enemy, which I've referenced that plenty of times in sermons before. The rest of the scene on the breastplate has a very detailed and complex divine scene on it. There are, and again, a number of figures on there. Up around the top of his chest is Sol, the Roman god of the sun. It's where we get the word solar from, known to the Greeks as Helios. Charioteering his sun the sun across the heavens, across the skies. We have Apollo there. We have Mars. We have Venus. There's a number of divine figures on this breastplate. Okay, so there's a clear militaristic tone to this, as well as the divine scene that is carved into the breastplate itself. But ironically and fascinatingly, that's actually probably not the most overt, on-the-nose component of this entire statue. There's two major things here, which are both specifically and overtly pointing to this divine status of the Roman Caesars. Okay, and they're not going to be obvious to you. The first one, which is the less obvious, is the fact that he's barefooted. To the casual observer, that would make be of little note, but to the one who knows ancient Greco-Roman history, they would understand that only the gods are ever portrayed as being shoeless, as being barefooted in their statues. There's a whole host of reasons as to why that's the case I won't bore you with, but any of the great human figures that had statues would always have sandals on, especially if they're in a military uniform, which he here is. In context, he should have shin plates, he should have the sandals, he should have there's a number of things on his legs there that should be there. But he's not. He's got bare legs and bare foot and bare feet, which was only demonstrated, as far as we can tell, in artwork or statues of the gods. So that's a clear indication of this divine component attached to the figure of Augustus. The other one, which is even more powerful and potent in its context, is the tiny little figure you see there next to his right leg. You might be going, what on earth is that? It seems so out of place. It seems rather odd to have this strong, triumphant figure of the great Caesar Augustus, military attire, he's standing there, a strong point into the distance, and yet he's got this little baby riding goodness knows what down at his leg. What on earth is that? That is the Roman god Cupid, okay, whose Greek equivalent is Eros, right? The god of love, right? And other things, but primarily love. Pictured to the Romans as a tiny little cherub, a little baby with wings. Okay, and you can see the wings coming off of his shoulder blades if you look behind him. He's riding, it's not as easy to make out there, but you can see it if you focus in. He's actually riding a dolphin. Okay, between his thighs is the fin of the dolphin, and if you come down to the point of its snout, you can see the eyes and whatnot. He's riding a dolphin as it crescends over the wave type of deal, right? That is because the patron symbol of Venus was a dolphin. In Greco-Roman mythology, Cupid was the son, divine son, but the god of Venus. Okay, he was the divine son, the god son of Venus and Mars. The exact same ancestor as Augustus via Julius Caesar. This is a very clear, overt, and explicit reference in the most powerful way to the divine ancestry of Augustus and Julius Caesar. Does that make sense? Okay. That is the loudest part of this entire statue to anyone who understands Greco-Roman history. He's clearly associating Augustus with Venus particularly. Okay. By extension Mars, but particularly Venus. And saying this man is a descendant of the gods in more way than one. So, thus is born the imperial cult of the Roman emperors. Again, as I mentioned, himself Augustus descended from Ascanius to Aeneas, who himself was a demigod by virtue of his birth from the goddess Venus. And so what this now has, to finish you here, what this now has is a common ancestral and cultural heritage that exists between the Greeks and the Romans. The Trojans themselves were a Greek people, okay? They had the exact same gods as the mainland Greeks, from Sparta, Argos, Athens, etc. Right? All the Greek gods and goddesses of that pantheon, okay, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Apollo, Artemis, etc., were the exact same deities in Troy, right, and the other cities of Troas. They're descended ethnically from Aeneas, not just in terms of the broader cultural context, but then their emperors are literally descended from Aeneas. And so there is a unification culturally across history, and as well as ancestrally, i.e. ethnically, between Greek and Roman. The Romans conquer the Greeks, unify the whole system into a one common civilization and culture with a shared custom and history. This is what we mean by the Greco-Roman world. Okay? And it's in this context that we find the formation of the civilization that conquered and ruled the world. So, thus ends this morning's lesson. We'll now move into question time. First off, of course, questions specifically related to this morning, and then any other questions beyond that, I'll indicate that from that point on. So if there's any questions related to this morning's subjects, yep.
How did his wife, you said he had 3 wives.
Yep.
How did they die?
Good question. I would need to go back and have a look. It's been a hot minute since I would have looked at that. It's entirely possible that it's a mixture of natural death and or not so natural death. I would need to go back and have a look. I don't recall off the top of my head. The main reason I don't recall is because the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty is filled with death. Augustus, if he did kill one of his wives, was not the first in that dynasty, let alone in the history of Rome. I'm using round figures here, but roughly 50% of all the emperors of Rome, from Augustus all the way down to Romulus Augustus, the last Roman emperor, at least half of them roughly were assassinated. So the entire, and usually almost always by the Praetorian Guard, who were the elite imperial bodyguards of the Roman emperor. So the answer is, how did his first 2 wives die or be otherwise moved on? I don't recall off the top of my head, I apologise. I'll take it on notice and I'll bring it into question time next week. Okay. You're right. Any other questions? Wonderful. Alrighty. Therein ends our third lesson. So the backdrop that we've had here built for us this morning then serves as the foundation for the specific cultural elements that we're going to look at next week, okay? So obviously we're not doing a gigantic deep dive into each of them, because every single component we could spend literally multiple weeks on each one of them. But what we're doing is we're giving, just like this morning, just like this afternoon, just like last week, we're getting the Cliff Notes version to get at least a comprehensive elementary survey of the landscape, right? So we're going to see what the common culture looked like, what the common language looked like, the common religious system, this combination of traditional paganism with the Eastern mystery cults, and then thirdly the Roman imperial cult, and how that all converged together, okay? But this accounting, this legendary history, right, the origins of Rome, you can hopefully see, at least from that glance that we've had, that survey across the stories, particularly of Aeneas and of Romulus and Remus, how the cultural identity of not just the Roman emperors as being the greatest men that have ever walked the earth, but also of the Romans being the greatest people that have ever lived, you can probably see how and why that came to be, correct? Yeah. That leaves us with a solid foundation for next week. So see you all next week for lesson number 4. Thank you.